Well, good evening, everybody. Once again, we've managed to start on time. Thank you very much to guests this evening, Tracy, all the way from Melbourne. Good evening, Tracy, from Melbourne. How's it going with you?
Hi, Paul. It's going not too bad, thank you.
Good, and not affected too much by any of the bushfires at the moment, I hope.
No, we've been on the end of a lot of smoke where I am, but
Right.
we're fortunate. We're not experiencing, obviously the catastrophic fires that are happening towards the east of Victoria and
Yeah.
New South Wales, of course. But yeah, no, it's been horrendous.
Yeah, it's just been incredibly hot, I believe. It's just
Yeah, and
is that like
yeah. And it's also the fact that, in various parts of Australia, there's been drought for years. So when you compound that with, continuously hot weather, you've got such dry conditions, you've got dry lightning, you've also got, throw into the mix people who light fires.
yes.
There's not a lot you can do about it, but it's heartbreaking over here at the moment.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I even watched one of the Big Bash League cricket matches. I'm sure everybody is well into their cricket, and one game actually got abandoned halfway through because of the smoke and the mist and the fog and everything, and they just couldn't carry on. And I mean that was in a city, that wasn't out in is it, you call it the bush anyway? Do you the sort of outer limits of the cities? It's called the bush.
Yeah, I mean, even, Melbourne yesterday, the MCG, which, I think you guys went to the MCG, it was covered in smoke.
Right.
But we did have a couple of, pretty intense fires up in suburbia, which is, very, very strange for Melbourne to have fires of that sort of intensity. But it's a trying time, that's for sure, for many people, particularly the farming community.
Yeah. I mean, it can't be very good for the koala bears and the kangaroos, that.
No, I think the estimates are around 500 million animals have been killed in the fires so far. I think the acreage is equivalent to something like the size of Belgium. That has been burnt out, and we're really at the beginning of summer of the hot weather, so it doesn't bear well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was there in March, it was that was autumn time for you.
Kind of. It's still quite warm in March. It's nowhere near where it reaches in January.
Yes.
But it's actually quite lovely in March. It's not too bad.
Yeah. And I must say, one of the highlights was meeting you, and also I don't mind telling you, while the dude is not here to listen to this, he was absolutely gobsmacked that you gave him that in effect backstage pass to go and meet Drizin Nyrider and David Rudolph. So that was that. I mean, that was I was incredibly touched by your generosity, and I know that he was as well. So thank you very much for that.
Stop. I mean, it was lovely to meet everyone, but I think the interesting thing was meeting everybody. It didn't seem like I was meeting strangers, and that's
Absolutely.
without being, cliched. It certainly felt, after 3.5 years of being involved in this community, that I knew you all. My son and his girlfriend had come to the evening as well, and so I had purchased tickets, and I had been fortunate that I was given a ticket for myself and my husband, and an extra one because I thought my son was just going to come with me. But so we bought 2 extra tickets so my son and his girlfriend could come. So we had the extra stage ticket, and I recall vividly actually walking towards you, and you waved it on to Richard. So you did a good a good deed for Richard as well, because I was just handing it over. But absolutely. I mean, it was quite a joyous thing
Yes, yes,
in
yeah.
a strange circumstance. Yeah.
Indeed, indeed. What was rather funny was the fact that, having met Jerry Buting in Amsterdam in December of last year, and having had a long chat with David Rudolph, and then having met Steve and Laura in Edinburgh in the January of December of 2 years ago. Yeah, let's get this right.
I know.
Having met them in such recent times, and I say it was. Well, what's today's date? Today's the 3rd. So this is nearly 1 year since I met Stephen Drizzen and Laura Nyrider in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
I thought, well, I've already had plenty of time to meet these guys, And also, I know for a fact that Stephen Drizzen doesn't like me very much, because he accused me of being Welsh.
Oh, stop! I have Welsh in my background as well. What can you do?
But
it's a cross to bear.
Yeah, can you remember when he said, "Oh, we've got a supporter here all the way from Wales"?
Yeah.
What?
You just have to embrace that stuff, Paul, and run with it.
Listen. Being involved in this, looking at this case and dealing with guilters, I've got thicker skinned. But if the guilters ever knew how to really insult me was to call me Welsh, then I think I would be called Taffy all the time, wouldn't I?
Yeah, if only they knew how easy it was, huh?
Exactly. If only they knew the things that Eric Jose knew, eh?
Yeah.
But anyway, it was very interesting, obviously, going to see Steve and Laura first of all, we saw them in Sydney at the Enmore Theatre, and then we went to see them again. And I think by then, probably Steve Drizzen and Laura and I were getting a bit freaked out at this mad Scotsman stalking them all over the world. So perhaps that was part of the problem. I've written down a couple of notes, and it's kind of a leading question. Is this one okay?
Be careful with leading questions. You know what can happen with leading questions.
I have no idea. What can happen at all.
Well, we saw what happened to Brendan. So
well, this is true. Yes. So what I've written down is that for me, it was incredibly cowardly to wrongfully convict an innocent person to avoid embarrassment and the financial penalty of a civil suit. So my question would be, how much worse is it then to bury alive somebody like Brendan, who has the mental age of, let's face it, a 5 to 10-year-old?
Well, I think the outrage stands for itself. I think the amici, I think the experts that signed on to the open letter to the governor speaks to how outrageous Brendan's conviction and the injustice is, and how it has touched people. I know that you had said to me previously, leading up to this, about how does Brendan resonate with people in a way that's different to Steve. And, I think that you roll that all the way back to just a vulnerable, suggestible 16-year-old child who, we had a bird's eye view of watching go through an extremely painful process. And, I can't speak to the legalities of what happened in Manitowoc in 2005 and 2006, but I can speak to how it makes me feel. And it is a sense of almost disbelief particularly when you go back through the trial transcripts. And only recently I was looking at the opening statement by Kratz, and I was like, how did he get away with that? How did he get away with that? I mean, obviously it was an ill-informed jury, but just getting back to how did they do it? How did they get away with it? They did it all with relative ease, unfortunately, because Brendan did not have a legal advocate in his corner that I think even understood Brendan himself, let alone understand the circumstances that, Brendan found himself in. You just have to look at Kaczynski, O'Callaghan, Fremgen, Edelstein. Not one of them were, I feel, this, obviously this is my opinion, and there wasn't a degree of empathy from any of them for Brendan or his, particular circumstances. So I don't think that Manitowoc and Calumet County back in 2006 gave any thought to what they were doing with, a 16-year-old child. He was collateral,
Very much so, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was purely to get at Steve, and as we've discovered, because of some of the phone calls when Steve is phoning various people and saying, that Brendan was with me all that time at the bonfire. This then possibly led to the fact that Wiegand and Fassbender wanted and Kratz wanted to destroy Steve's alibi. What better way of doing it? And am I right to say that in some reports he's been assessed as having in effect this mental age of somewhere between a 5 and a 10-year-old?
Yeah, that's correct. Absolutely.
Yeah,
and even in the recent reports by Dr. Miles and Professor Levine, they clearly state that Brendan's sentence structure was of a child much younger than himself. So I don't think that that's debatable. It certainly was overlooked, purposely overlooked, no doubt. But certainly not debatable.
Yeah, I must explain, by the way, obviously to some of the listeners that wouldn't realise that whenever I've got a question about Brendan Dassey, you're one of my go-to people, and as soon as I send you a question, you're back with me with the actual bit of the trial transcript to explain exactly what had happened and where it happened. And you must know that trial word for word, virtually, Tracy.
It's been an interesting 4 years, Paul.
Yeah.
It's part of every day for me now, to some extent. I have my finger in a few different pies, and it's I've said it to many people. It's definitely an odyssey. And we don't choose causes. Well, there are people that choose a cause, but this certainly chose me. And it's
strange how we've got myself and you. We are in Scotland and Australia, and we're talking about a case that took an incident. This wrongful convictions of Stephen Brendan took place in Wisconsin. What could possibly have drawn us into this case? Well, it was obviously making a murderer to begin with. For me, I take it was for you. Can you remember what when you first watched Making a Murderer? What your initial thoughts were?
Yeah, absolutely. We hadn't long moved back from living in Ireland. And my son, my husband and daughter were watching it in the lounge room. And I was in the family room writing, as I'm always found. And all I heard was Brendan's voice. And my daughter called me and said, "Mum, you have to come and see this." And I was absolutely gutted, immediately gutted. I then went on to watch the series, then just turned on the internet. How can I help? So I actually read a article the other day in memoriam for the passing of Karen L. Daniel, and there was
Yes.
a reference to her having an allergy to injustice, and just that statement just stuck with me. And I thought, what an amazing allergy to have.
Yeah.
And and to a certain degree, I have always been moved by an injustice on any scale. And the scale of what happened to Brendan just felt so overwhelming. I felt for both men, of course. That goes without saying. I think anybody that watches Making a Murderer automatically feels for both men. I felt for the families, in particular Barb and Dolores. But I could not shake the ache in the gut I had for Brendan. And then knowing that 10 years on, this was, early 2016, that he was still incarcerated, I scoured the internet because I was hoping it was a social experiment. I was hoping that I was going to find that the series was fictional.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it wasn't. And even now, 4 years on, I struggle to watch those episodes with Brendan. I struggle to watch the individual interrogations. So it was early 2016. I just started absorbing everything that I possibly could, and jumped into what was a burgeoning community of outraged individuals from all over the globe. Social media was like this heaving, breathing, entity of its own, that full of outrage for Brendan and Stephen. And I remember it. I remember it like I remember being 7 when Elvis when Elvis died. I remember being 10 when John Lennon died, where I was, what I heard and things like that. So it's an indelible memory, that's for sure, when I first watched The Murderer.
Absolutely. Just to rewind, you mentioned the passing of somebody called, is it Daniels?
Karen Daniel.
Yeah, she was the head of the wrongful conviction unit.
Yeah, she was the director of the Center of Wrongful Conviction.
Yeah.
She had retired in 2018.
Right.
I don't know too much about Karen. I do remember when I first started using Twitter, for example, she was one of the first people that started following me after I started talking about Brendan. And I was like, wow, that's incredible, because I had a look into who she was. But yeah, no, obviously a tragic accident.
Yes, very much.
Horrendous loss to all that knew her, obviously, but the wrongful conviction movement in general. I mean, between herself and I think it's Jane Rayleigh, who had passed away a few years back as well. They had exonerated over 20 people.
Yes.
That's an incredible legacy to leave behind.
I must admit, I was touched by, at the end of episode 10 of the original series of Making a Murderer, when Brendan reads out the letter, dear people in the world, please help me if you can. And I thought, well, there's only so much I can do here in Scotland. I'll probably, the same for a lot of people throughout the world. But just by highlighting and talking about this, it's making it into the to use the American term, the phenomenon that it is. And
I can't say that word.
It's brilliant, the American accent, and we'll have to get the dude on to just to say phenomenon. And I believe he will be joining us shortly. Can I just take you back to my first experience of watching Making a Murderer? I was particularly outraged with the sheriff department because of the socially I know people who are both work for the police and are retired police officers, and I just saw the disgrace of what was going on, and the fact that for the police, they are a tight-knit community, and when they've got a few bad ones that drag down the name of everybody else, because let's not kid ourselves. If you've got corruption like that going on in Manitowoc, it makes you wonder what's going on elsewhere, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Sure. I mean, they're states unto themselves, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah. It took me a long time to get over my, for want of a better word, my annoyance at Brendan acquiescing and just going along with everything that Wiegert and Fassbender were saying to him. At times, he was just putting out everything in their mouths. One of the things that's quite interesting now is I'm looking at these articles by Drizzen and Leo and Kassan and all these other people.
Yeah.
And I always say to people, if you're watching this for the first time, there are certain videos you must watch. And Steve Drizzen and Laura write a true story of a false confession. It's 2 hours and 10 minutes, but it's a must-see video for me.
Yes, I agree.
Did you already have a knowledge about wrongful convictions, or at least some aspects of the law before you watched Making a Murderer?
Very little, to be honest with you. I grew up in Australia through the Lindy Chamberlain case, where she was, it's our biggest wrongful conviction case, where she was wrongfully convicted of murdering her 9-week-old baby. The dingo case, so to speak. Yeah,
that was up in the Northern Territory. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. It was at Ayers Rock.
Yes,
but that was very much a case that was tried on her religion, on her behaviour.
Yes.
And the public just being affronted by the fact that she wasn't behaving in the way that they felt that they would behave.
Yeah.
And bad forensics. It's the script. It's a prescription for wrongful convictions. But in terms of the law and things like that, I've been a volunteer for Amnesty. I've always had my foot in, human rights, so to speak, and things like that. But the false confession world was certainly something different for me. But I knew instinctively when I watched that interrogation that it wasn't right. And I think it was the obvious imbalance of power that was in that room, and Brendan's inability to comprehend that what was actually happening to him. And it was almost like Wiegert and Fassbender were, they were rabid in their interrogation of Brendan, which makes me laugh when you look at Hamilton's, one of his dissents, where he talks about, the investigators coaxed it gently from Lassie, coaxed it gently. Don't get me started on his wording. It was like a Meals and Boons novel or something, but I hadn't dipped my toes too far in, but I can certainly tell you, as soon as I watched it, I started to, and it's certainly been a learning process on many different levels. Not only from a legal perspective, but the false confession arena, so to speak, and the wrongful conviction spaces. It's become part of my everyday thinking now. Could I have told you 4 years ago this is where I'd landed? I think for some people that knew me well, probably it's not that much of a surprise.
Right. Okay.
That I would have dug so deep into something, but no, I was pretty much a newbie to the whole idea of false confessions, because I can't recall, besides the Guildford Four or the Birmingham Six, being in Irish history.
Yes.
Having known of false confessions, I certainly did not hear of Brendan Dassey and Stephen Avery in 2006. Didn't hear a word of it.
Yes, as I say, as I've mentioned before, it was my daughter who was actually studying journalism through in Glasgow that said, "Oh, you." Well, first of all, on a night out in Glasgow, she said, "I've just watched this thing in." She said, "Let's get this right." She said, "Have you ever heard of a place called Manitowoc?" And I'm like, no, She said, "Well, it's in Wisconsin." I said, "Well, I know that there's a place called Green Bay in Wisconsin because there's a very, very famous football team, American football team there." I said, "But I hadn't heard of Manitowoc, and then she said, "Well, you'll have to watch this." And she said, "Do you think that the police would deliberately, frame somebody for murder in order to get them out of this this civil suit that was pending?" And I said, "Well, I find that hard to imagine. I find that hard to believe. I know people as I say, both current and retired police officers." I thought, well, no, that's not going to be very likely from the people that I know. They're all, very, very good. Do sometimes the police take an attitude towards people that they feel are guilty? Yes, I can see that. I can see that the need to make sure that if you have a suspicion of somebody, that you really do try and get to the bottom of it by putting pressure on them. But then when she said, well, the nephew, the young nephew, he confessed to the murder, and it's like, well, there you go. Then what is there to discuss about this? It's pretty clear cut. I don't know what your problem is. So anyway, we then 2 weeks later, she was back down in Galashiels, and she'd actually bought this Netflix subscription, which enabled her to then apprehend and take over the main TV in the living room, and insisted that we sit down and watch it. And we were just gobsmacked. We just couldn't believe what we were. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. As I say, my initial outrage was at the sheriff's department, which is why I immediately got in touch with a certain Robert Herman, who it did surprise me how laissez-faire he was about everything. It was like, there's nothing to worry about here. Everything's okay. Yes, it caused a bit of embarrassment, but we're okay with it. So it's. I must admit, I was when I watched Brendan's confession. As I say, I was a little bit sort of, why are you doing that? Why are you just, because it's something that I would never do. I mean, as a youngster, I'm not saying that, I didn't have my brushes with the law, as it were, but as a youngster, it's just a case of, they're just kids. They're just doing what kids do. But I couldn't imagine me ever, admitting.
And therein lies the problem, isn't it? It's that the majority of people just, it's so counterintuitive, the idea that you're going to confess to something that you didn't do. It's like, well, you know what? I would never do that. But you and I don't know the pressures that are brought to bear on somebody in the interrogation room. We don't know how. I think it research shows that people from all levels of society are susceptible. Every single person is susceptible to giving a false confession under certain circumstances. So when you have a perfect storm of youth, of intellectual limitations, of heightened suggestibility, of vulnerability, when you have all of these factors in play, it's a perfect storm and somebody who's socially avoidant, somebody who struggles with language, with language comprehension. When that child is sitting in an interrogation room, the viewer is not going to understand that on first viewing. And I'm sure back in 2006 that the media outlets, they didn't understand that all of those elements played into Brendan giving a false confession. confession is like the gold standard of evidence. It trumps everything. People
Yes.
can't get their heads around it. But there is a definite science, and there is a lot of research. And I think when I spoke to Dr. Leo, I can't remember exactly, but I think the research into false confessions goes back to the early 1900s.
Yes.
So it's not even that it's new. It's not even that it's a new research. It's just that counterintuitiveness, that people can't believe that people would do it if they haven't done something wrong. And therein, like I said, therein lies the problem. Your initial reaction is an initial reaction perhaps for many, many people who then just go on with their lives. They don't decide to do the deep dive into the case, or the deep dive into what's happened to Brendan, or, assess, journals on behavior analysis or things like that. So they just go on with their lives going, that kid gave a confession. Why would you do that? Why would you self-incriminate? But there are obviously, ploys at play that led him into the giving of a false and coerced confession. It's on hindsight. It's because we know. It's because we learnt. It's because we wanted to deep dive into it. But that first initial reaction you had of annoyance of, he gave a false a confession, that stays with most people. They don't go looking. They don't go looking for why has that happened.
I was going to say that you mentioned back in as far back as the early 1900s, I believe, that there was people looking into false confessions, but it was more anecdotal. It was more looking at what actually happened rather than looking at the reasons why.
I think it's been a science from my my little knowledge that I have. It's been a science that's evolved, obviously, and perhaps there would be more famous false confessions if there had been greater insight over the years. We just don't know. We just don't know. But thankfully, I mean, if Making Murderer has done one thing, it has certainly brought to light false confessions and placed it firmly on the dinner table in front of families who, and I think we see that, that level of not acceptance, but that level of knowledge has grown, certainly in regards to false confessions. And that needs to happen. Obviously, we're human. We're made of variables. We don't react the same to the same stimulus. It's it's an extremely interesting field, no doubt. And having spoken to, I refer to Dr. Leo a lot. I did speak to Dr. White as well, but Dr. Leo was like, I found him quite incredible.
Yeah, he was actually a witness that was called by, I believe, Drizzen and Nyrider at the appeals stage for Brendan.
That's correct. Yeah, he had been contacted late 2009, and he gave testimony in the January of 2010. He assessed all of the materials. He wrote a report which is available online, and he was quite open with me that he felt that Judge Fox was quite apathetic about, his testimony. He doesn't think that Judge Fox paid it any attention whatsoever. Yeah. We went on to discuss the voluntariness standard quite in depth. I recommend anyone reading the interview, not only because it's on Brendan's website, but because it's infinitely interesting. And one of the I was on the phone with Dr. Leo for quite some time, and I was reluctant to let him go because I was like, you're just such a font of information. What else can I possibly ask you?
Yes.
But, you know, he obviously found the interrogation was coercive. You know, it was an involuntary confession. It had additional unreliability, and it was thoroughly contaminated. But I thought it really interesting, and Dr. Lear pointed out to me, and it's not something that we're not aware of. It's just something I don't think I've heard anybody consciously say. He said, you know, obviously there was no evidence linking Brendan to the crime, which of course we know that there's no DNA. There's absolutely, you know, zero, nada evidence. But he said, and I thought this was interesting, Stephen Avery never linked Brendan to any crime.
Absolutely.
And I thought nobody's actually voiced that before. And that's very, very true. You know, it's Stephen hasn't, you know, at all. And it could have been a get out of jail card, maybe somewhere along the way, or you know, a lessening of sentence. I don't know, you know, but to me, it was just quite an interesting statement that he made, and I thought, yeah, you're so right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, so he had testified at Brendan's trial, and as I said, I had spoken a couple of months earlier with Dr. White, and I'd reached out to them because I found for Brendan's website and the articles that I write for it, it's very much what I'm trying to do is either create advocates or reach out to those who are involved in the case, those who are publicly advocating for Brendan, and those who might publicly advocate for Brendan. And I really wanted to speak to Dr. White because, you know, there's this grey area where he had been retained by Booting and Strang. You know, he wrote a lengthy report, but he wasn't called to testify. As we know, history tells us he wasn't called to testify. And then you have Jerry Booting. He contacted Mark Fremgen, Brendan's trial attorney, to offer the services of Dr. White. Dr. White agreed, but he did feel at the time that Dr. Leo or Sol Cassin would have been more qualified. And however, he didn't hear from Fremgen. And as we know, Fremgen's defence strategy or lack thereof declined to engage in what he termed a battle of the experts. So questionable, unbelievably questionable. It was an unreasonable tactic. It denied the jury of expert instruction on coercion, you know, contamination, the dynamics of the interrogation process. And Dr. White had said to me that when he didn't hear from Fremgen, when he learned that a false confession expert had not testified at Brendan's trial, he felt sick and he felt worried. And in hindsight, he wishes he'd been more proactive about testifying at Brendan's trial. And to me, that gave me a great sense of sadness, because he then went on to say once he watched Making a Murderer, it reinforced that. But it was like there was nobody willing at that particular time to really put themselves out for Brendan in a legal sense. And but it was really interesting, you know, the maneuverings of having Dr. White by, you know, Avery's defence counsel, and then, you know, not having to use them. He was a paid for expert. He was waiting to go. And Fremgen goes, nope, that's not the strategy I'm going with. You know, Fremgen's strategy was built around trying to make Brendan a more sympathetic character. And to me, that is outrageous. You have a false confession case. You have a case that, you know, spins on a false confession. There is no other evidence, and you're not going to present a false confession expert to the jury. You're not going to educate that jury on you know, the processes behind the giving of a false confession. When you have a 16-year-old developmentally delayed child as your client, you're not going to do that. Don't tell me that's not ineffective. Like, these are my soapboxes, you know what I mean?
Sure. By Dr. White, we're obviously referring to Larry White, who appears a couple of times in the first episode. And it was interesting because it was in an email with I think it was Jerry Buting, he pointed out that, him and Dean Strang had hired a couple of experts, and one of them was Professor Larry White.
That's correct.
It was either him or Steve Drizzen that said, that they did hire experts, but for some reason, Larry White never got the opportunity to actually present any of his, his observations of the coerced confession. And I mean, I keep going back to it. It's in a way, it's incredibly funny. You'll have seen the Charlie Berens parody of called "Making a Husband," and I thought that was just absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's funny, but then on the other hand, it's dealing with something which isn't really that funny at all. Just going back to the point about the both judges, Willis and Fox. Again, something that was pointed out to me by Jerry Buting was the fact that those two judges are really just concerned with re-election, aren't they? They're just, the judges have to be voted. They have to be elected. They were concerned with re-election. It just seems very bizarre to somebody sitting in the UK that you can have elections for judges, so that if you like one judge, you vote for them. If you don't like them, you don't vote for them. Even Brad Schimmel, when he was asked about the appeal to the Seventh Circuit en banc, he said that when they saw what judges they'd got for the initial review, he guessed that they were going to lose immediately, because some would be on his side and some would be against him. And I thought, well, that's a terrible statement to say, that you're basically predicting the football game before you've even played it. That you're admitting, therefore, that your judges will be on one side or the other. That regardless of what's presented to them, they've already made up their mind.
Absolutely. I mean, and you have special interest groups at play as well, who are funding these campaigns. So, I mean, you just have to look at the Supreme Court, which is another therapy session, I guess. But you just have to look at the Supreme Court and that polarizing division between Republicans and Democrats, and who they want sitting on there because of the balance of power. But at a local level, when you have judges being voted in, there's no difference. I mean, people are voting because of their own ideologies, their own beliefs, and they're voting for somebody that perhaps shares those types of beliefs, so they'll see that in the justice system. What can you do with that? You're going to have cognitive dissonance and cognitive biases, and there's nothing that you can do about that. That's entrenched in your justice system, because it's at the highest level within your state. Your judges have been voted in by people with their own agendas, and those judges share those same beliefs and ideologies. And I guess if you look at that particular time, like I don't like to call it small town thinking, but there was definitely small town thinking. And it didn't serve Brendan, it didn't serve Stephen. We know that there was no presumption of innocence for either men. We know that the DA gave a completely unethical press conference, which totally removed any presumption of innocence. It was Brendan and Stephen swimming upstream, and they were drowning. So
yes, yeah. I wanted to ask you something, but before I get on to that one, have you had a chance to watch Confession Killer?
Is that the Henry somebody or other?
Henry Lee Lucas.
No, I started to watch it.
Right.
I'm somebody that if you don't get me in the first 10 to 15 minutes, I'm out.
Sure. Yeah.
And particularly with, those type of documentaries.
Yes.
And for some reason, it didn't stick with me.
Sure.
I didn't continue watching it. Yeah, and I think it was because, from my little knowledge of it, is that he actually did some of it, and I was like, I don't want to know about that.
Yes.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's like, give me the false confession stuff. That's where I'm sitting.
Yeah.
Like the I love The Innocent Man. I thought that was done
Yes.
really well. And
That was partly to do with that author of the book. What was his name
John
again?
Grisham.
That's it. Yes, John.
Yes.
It was the only book that he ever wrote that was based on a true story.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm actually reading one of his books at the moment, The Guardian.
Right.
And it's the first John Grisham book that I've bought, but I bought it off the back of listening to him on the Wrongful Conviction podcast with Jason Flom, which I absolutely love listening to. And he had been on, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to put some money in John Grisham's pocket because of the work that he does in the wrongful conviction space.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not my usual type of reading, but good.
Yeah. No, I must admit, it was Travis Williamson, that Esquire, that first alerted me to the confession killer. And I know what you mean. There was grainy footage from the early 80s, and you think, oh, that it's maybe not really what I want to watch. But there are so many stories within a story, and if we ever wanted a story about a district attorney who bucks the trend of being totally ethical, then please watch it, because you will love to hear about Vic Feazell.
Right.
I can't speak more highly of him than he is just an incredible character. In the last episode, there's only 5 episodes, and they're only about 45 minutes. In the last one, we get to hear about how the crimes that Henry Lee Lucas confessed to are all being undone, and we even have a police investigator looking at an interview with Henry Lee Lucas, saying, this is not how a confession goes down. The interrogators need to shut up. It needs to come from the person being interviewed.
Yeah.
All the details. So when Wiegert and Fassbender are interviewing Brendan, I seem to remember they make it clear, at least certainly they do, and Kaczynski very much so, make it clear that what they want Brendan to do is they want him to learn a story and be able to repeat it in front of a judge and a jury. That really this whole idea of him confessing, he could have just have said, look, I was there and I saw Steve do this, I saw Steve do that, I saw Steve do this. Now get on the stand, repeat it, everything will be fine. And it was all about taking this plea deal. What beggars belief for me is that you've got Mike Holbach saying, I believe this was at the sentencing, that Brendan should have taken the plea deal because, obviously it would lead to the fact that instead of being locked up for, I believe he's due out on November the 1st of 2048, if I'm right, at the age of 59. That's when he's due. Well, sorry, no, that's not due
when he's eligible.
It's for parole, but that would only be only on the circumstance that he confessed. Yeah. So I'm left thinking, well, what on earth is going on there? The whole idea of a confession, it's supposed to make things clearer.
Yeah. I think that they found, if you go to the March 13th interview as well, I think you found that the more that they spoke to Brendan, the more the story changed, and you know, and here's the thing, you know, is that old adage where they say that if you tell the truth, you have nothing to remember. So the thing is with Brendan, he didn't know what he was telling. He
Exactly.
did not know the story. He did not know the intricacies of the story. He did not remember what he had told them before. So everything was changing all the time in what he was telling them. And glad that they were frustrated. They weren't frustrated enough for my liking. But you know, he did not know what he was telling. The details were changing. Of course they were changing, because he didn't know the story verbatim as they had hoped over the 4 interrogations in 48 hours. And let us not kid ourselves, they were not interviews. You know, interviews are fact-finding perhaps to a certain level. But it's interrogative interviews, it's interrogations where there's a presumption that the defendant or, you know, the individual sitting in front of you knows something about a crime. So every single one of those 4 interrogations, they were priming and grooming Brendan's story. You know, we look at the Fox Hills transcript, and if you take a look at that, it is so clear, in particular to commentary about the oil spill. And you know, Brendan, I don't have it here, but you know, Brendan's like, yes, it smelled like oil, it looked like oil, or something to that effect. And then you have, I think it's Fassbender that says, you know, what color was it? And Brendan says red, and he said, well, it could be blood. And Brendan said, well, you know, it could be blood. And then it's something like, well, you know, it was blood. And Brendan said, well, it could have been blood. Do you know what I mean? So here's the thing. There's an obvious manipulation of Brendan and how easily it was done. So this is, you know, this is at a very base level that he was able to manipulate Brendan within, you know, a matter of a paragraph and a half to come from Brendan believing himself that it was spilt oil, that he was cleaning oil. And, you know, to the fact that he's then going, well, no, it could be blood. You know what I mean? So it's, I mean, and that's in a paragraph and a half. Imagine the damage they did to that boy in those 4 interrogations. And yeah, you know, I don't know. I'm an expert in absolutely nothing, but I do know that in confession is so riddled with inconsistencies that it should have been thrown out. It should have been suppressed. The fact that, you know, Fox allowed that to, you know, to continue was the beginning of the end for Brendan in that respect. You know, you look at people like James Tranium, I suppose, you know, who saw what he did in an interrogation, and you know, disgusted himself and went and rectified that. How Wiegert and Fassbender came out of an interrogation on March the 1st with a sense of having done a great job is mind-boggling. I don't know what level of empathy or lack of you have to be able to do that to a child. You have a child asking you how to spell rack.
Yes, and garage.
And you persist, you don't get a parent, you know, and they didn't get a parent. They knew what they were doing. They started that process on the 27th of February, and it was on the back of Kayla having flagged the fact that Brendan was crying, and flagged the fact that Brendan had lost weight. God forbid a 16-year-old was crying. God forbid a 16-year-old was trying to lose weight. They're obviously, you know, pointers towards somebody having done criminal activity. Are you kidding me? You know, are you kidding me? And then also a witness placing Brendan at the bonfire. So they bring him back in on the 27th.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned the oil on the floor. Back in, believe it or not, in the early 1990s, I'm actually a fully qualified motor mechanic, and I worked for 3 years in a garage, both both as a mature student getting work experience, and then I was taken on by the garage. The red oil is transmission oil. It's obviously what cars need, particularly in there, because most of the Americans drive automatic gearboxes. So it's very much in garages. Even back in the early 90s, whenever we had any kind of oil spill, it had to be cleared up straight away using some sort of absorbent material, and for two reasons. One, it actually attacks the concrete floor. Yeah. But also, I didn't even realize this until it was pointed out to me that also used oil, or I don't know if it's just used oil or oil in general, is actually carcinogenic. And that's another reason why, nowadays more and more mechanics use latex gloves so that they don't get so much oil on their hands. It's not because they've got their fingernails beautifully manicured. It is to do with the fact that it's been proven that as I say, the oil is carcinogenic. I wanted to move on to the because it was funny how it was Ken Kratz himself, under the guise of Charlie that first alerted me to the fact that Steve Drizzen and Richard Leo's book or article, False Confessions in the Post-DNA World, was actually cited. And Ken Kratz was pointing out, do you think it's right that the judge should be citing this book or this article by Drizzen and Leo? And I replied with, well, can you imagine the Seventh Circuit citing a book by Ken Kratz as a reason to ignore, false confessions? Let's get it right here,
Yeah, I actually commented as well. I think you saw it under my Google, which is Justice for Brendan Dassey, Justice and Freedom for Brendan Dassey. It's like, what is particularly interesting about Kratz, and I don't like to talk about Mr. Kratz because, first of all, I find him extremely boring, and I find the fact that he is trying to still be relevant, throughout this process, quite sad, really. But
I find Kratz entertaining, personally.
I certainly don't. I just find it boring. But
I think he's a piece of crap for what he's done. But the way that he tries to spin nowadays just makes me laugh.
But I can see the amusement value. But for me, I'm just going to scroll past that. I think there's been one that I couldn't. But
did you chuckle a little bit? But did you chuckle a little bit when AC Rookie got the better of him in that one interview?
Oh yeah, that
was awesome.
That's poetry. That's poetry. But what's interesting with Mr. Kratz coming back on that is that the Judge Duffin cites false confession in the post-DNA world, and has been cited more than 980 times by a variety of academic reports, behavioral analysis journals, studies, including those by Sol Casson, Brandon Garrett. It's empirical research. It's not speculative conjecture. It's not, particular opinion. And Duffin references the study, I think it's about page 68, in rebuttal of the prosecution statement that innocent people don't confess. But it's worth noting that the study was presented as an exhibit by the state in its cross-examination of Dr. Leo at Brendan's post-conviction hearing, right? So who was sitting there for the state? Ken Kratz and Fallon.
Yeah.
Dr. Leo's testimony relied on Brendan Garrett's The Substance of False Confessions. He wasn't referring to it. Yeah. So I think the inclusion in the habeas opinion is because the fact the state entered it as an exhibit. So why did Mr. Kratz not remember that? He was sitting there at the desk.
Selective memory.
Yeah, and if we talk,
we all know he claims he never said sweat DNA. So,
Yeah. That those types of statements, like, why would they not use, Mr. Kratz's book? Because I'm sure that they don't use fiction in legal opinions. Do you know what I mean? Like, yes, sorry, but that,
Yeah, let's not refer to the disgraced prosecutor, right? Is there somebody else who wrote a book that we can refer to?
Well, hold on a sec. In fairness to Ken Kratz, when he was doing his videos about promoting his books, I put a comment about the fact that the only purpose for getting one of Ken Kratz's books would be to put on the fire in case it was a very cold winter. To which Kratz actually replied to me, "I'll put you down as a maybe then, Paul."
I do think, Paul, that you enjoy Mr. Kratz. Am I wrong?
No, I think he's. I would put it.
I think you have fun popping off at him. Actually.
Yeah, but what I find sad is the fact that somebody who is clearly he's got a very I don't know how to say this, but he's got a certain talent that is being misdirected. Let's put it that way. That with somebody with a sharper mind as his, he could have used that to some good. Bless him. We've got Travis here in the chat talking about a couple of days back, talking about Vic Fazell, and there we see how good a district attorney can be, one that goes against the kind of corruption that he was up against and comes out the other side. But you've got somebody like Ken Kratz who, has got in some ways, he's got as I say, a certain talent, but it's just completely wasted in what he's doing. If he'd
in the way that he's chosen to use it, absolutely,
yes, yeah. And for me, that's the tragedy here.
Yeah, that may be the case, but he stole the ability of Brendan Dassey and Stephen Avery to reach for whatever they were going to achieve in their lives. He stole that from them. So I don't particularly care if Mr. Kratz has wasted his intellectual capacity on malevolent doings. What he's done is effectively stolen the ability for Brendan to have become what he could have become. Right. So I know what you're saying. I just don't care.
Okay. No. Last two questions for both Tracy and the dude himself. Number one, I'm sure I've asked you this one before, dude. So we'll let Tracy go first on this. Number one would be thoughts on Ken Kratz. Saying that I was completely lost when I read that email from him to Tom Fallon asking for seats at the En Banc hearing, the one on Valentine's Day 2017, and he talks about an adjustment of the sentence. I actually got in touch with Steve Drizzen and said to him, "You mean Ken Kratz wants Brendan's sentence extended?" And Steve Drizzen wrote back, said, I've never seen this before. Where did this come from? No, he's not talking about an extension of the sentence. So what are your thoughts on Ken Kratz suggesting now? Because he's basically saying that we think that he thinks that the state should adjust his sentence and bring it down. So what is this problem with this bid for clemency? I don't quite square the circle here.
I don't either, to be honest with you. I think, what is it? Is it guilt? Was it, attack of guilt that or the fact that he still wanted to have some sort of say in the outcome of Brendan's process by saying, should there be an adjustment to a sentence that would keep him involved? Perhaps. I honestly don't know. In terms of him then, particularly on Twitter, he's I don't know. There's, Twitter can be a seething mass of viciousness at the best of times, but to then publicly and tag Governor Evers, I should say that right, people correct me, to tag Governor Evers in saying, he did it right.
Right.
Why does he still care? Why is he still trying to maintain two very questionable convictions? Well, we all believe absolutely wrongful convictions. Why is he still involving himself? That to me is infinitely questionable. Why he still feels a relevancy towards these cases. How long's it been since he's practiced? He
resigned in 2010.
Yeah, so for me, when the adjustment of the sentence, for me, that reeks of somebody who's still trying to be involved, still having a part in a process. Could it be guilt? Who knows? I would very much doubt it, because if somebody is capable of guilt, then they wouldn't have subjected Brendan to what they did. They wouldn't have stole his presumption of innocence at a press conference. They wouldn't have lied to a jury in the opening statement, telling the jury, make notes, get your paper and your pen and make notes. What I'm going to tell you, you can reflect back on. And I'm going to tell you that you're going to see the entire March 1st statement given by Brendan Dassey. We're going to show you from start to finish the entire admission. No, they didn't.
Right.
He describes the interrogation techniques used against Brendan as if it was a run-of-the-mill exercise. He creates a roadmap of forgiveness for Wiegert and Fassbender. Should any jury find themselves questioning what they're looking at. So in that opening statement, he's giving a free pass to that behavior. And he's talking about, this is all in the opening statement. He has told the jury, you need to write this shit down. And he's going, on March the 1st, Brendan Dassey was still a witness. He wasn't a suspect at all. I call bullshit on that. He wasn't he wasn't on the radar screen. That's not true. We have a clipping where the DA in a media interview states that Brendan was targeted. He openly lied to Brendan's jury. In those opening statements, he set it up. Brendan never stood a chance. So was it guilt? Probably not. Was it trying to be relevant? Absolutely, I think.
Right.
Eric Cozy, I think you've got...
So you're just to review here. The question was, why would Kratz be, advocating for Brendan to get a lesser sentence, say, in the final 2 added chapters of his newly released paperback book, which should give you guys some hint as to why he's talking about reducing Brendan's sentence, because he's hoping a bunch of freaking sheep are going to, supporter sheep are going to run right over and buy his book. That's what he was hoping for. Okay. Then when it actually became an actual possibility, when Brendan's lawyers actually filed for clemency and it was like actually possibly a reality, then he freaks out, wigs out, and sends Governor Evers a tweet and says, he did it right. That's what happened. There you go.
Yeah.
I mean, in one of his, in one of the book reviews that I did of Ken Kratz's original book, one of the reviewers actually pointed out the line that Ken Kratz says that he loses no sleep whatsoever over the prosecution of Brendan Dassey.
Shame on him.
He has
it shows.
no.
Looks like he's aged horribly, so it shows.
Yeah.
Well, shame on him. Shame on him. I think it's universally agreed by greater minds than Mr. Kratz that what happened to Brendan Dassey was an egregious miscarriage of justice. So, anybody who pays any attention to the opinion of the DA that conducted the trial and prosecution of Brendan Dassey, more fool them, I say.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to the next question. Again, I'm not too sure if I've asked you this one on a live video before, dude. So we'll maybe go with you first if that's okay.
But who cares? Let's go.
Why did Governor Tony Evers take so long for such a brief decision?
Oh, I don't know. There's a number of reasons.
Well, okay, I'll put it this way. Is there a possibility that he did actually look at what was being said and thought,
well, that's what I was going to say.
I'd love to do something. I'd love to do something, but is it politically?
He may have been looking at it for a minute, and he may have been tempted to do something about it. But being a politician, he had that nagging thing at the back of his mind going, yeah, but if you do this, it could be bad for you. Because he's not as certain about Brendan as we are. Mm-hmm. Okay? So he sees it as a risk at this point. He needs to look into it more.
Yeah.
Honestly. He needs to, I'd have been fine if he took a year with it. Personally, I could have waited. I've been waiting long enough for all this crap. So I could wait a little longer to make sure things get done properly. I'm actually at the point of, in fact, I'd like things to get done properly. I don't mind waiting a little longer. I know everybody else is rush, come on, Quan, hurry up. But no, I'm not. I don't want things to get rushed anymore. I want things to get done right. So absolutely. I wish he would have taken some more time with it. And then I wish he would have brought in a team of interns to be his personal researchers into it so that he could spend maybe 30 minutes, an hour a week with those people, and they can tell him what they've been finding. You know, they can give him ideas of all the papers that have been written and all the things out there, the amicus briefs, all that sort of stuff that he should probably be aware of. He could possibly get a little team of interns to do his research for him and brief him on it. And then he could make a more informed decision. But like I said, I think he may have been tempted by it. It may have sat on his desk that long because he may have been tempted to grant. But he ultimately, I think, decided against it.
Yeah, the main reason I ask, I suppose, is because, am I right, Tracy, in saying that the petition is simply going to be sent back to Governor Evers to think again?
Well, my take on this whole situation is, in hindsight, he didn't take long enough. So I totally agree with Richard with that. I don't believe the governor's reviewed the petition. He didn't, as far as I know, meet with Brendan's team. I think it's highly doubtful that he went through the record or the recommendations or the amicus briefs, the expert letters. If he had, he would have granted clemency. Right. I think this went to the pardons board as a matter of process. The pardons board have stuck by the guidelines, the criteria, and rejected the petition. Now, the pardons board, fortunately, is not the final word. The executive power lay with the governor of Wisconsin. The guidelines are not law. They are goalposts. They are movable. And so they should be. As I wrote in the open letter to the governor, the origins of clemency in Wisconsin speak to the governor assessing the judicial history of a case. They have not done that. And, you know, as far back as the 1920s, they recognized that it's a vehicle for correcting a miscarriage of justice. It is an ideal vehicle for correcting a miscarriage of justice. And they did not do that, obviously. So I think Governor Evers has room to move. He has the final word. Do I think it's over? Absolutely not. Do I think he's looked at it? Absolutely not. I think it went to the pardons board, they've gone against the criteria. You know, if they had looked into the petition on its merits, which is what, you know, Brendan's legal team are now requesting of the governor, whenever I say governor, I want to say it in a London accent. I've got to stop.
like on the Sweeney. All right, governor.
Governor. So I think if they had looked at it, if they had looked into the merits of this case, if they had assessed the judicial history and the facts of this case, that the only reasonable outcome would have been to grant Brendan clemency. So because they haven't, I don't believe that they've done that. We have been rallied to re-sign the petition, and in the comments put in, to review the petition on its merits. So I don't think it's over by a long shot. And certainly with a governor like Mr. Evers, I think, there's definitely room not to convince, but to inform and to educate a man who considers himself a progressive. I don't know whether or not he would be bound by the political outcome of granting Brendan Dassey clemency. I guess, I haven't been to Wisconsin. I don't know the lay of the land, but I do know in terms of the open letter that I've done with supporters that there's a lot of support from Wisconsin. And I think that support is growing. We hear from Professor Narida, the support is growing. So I think it's vitally important that we harness the support in Wisconsin. It's like, they're the first wave. All of us were the second wave of support. We need that first wave. And I don't think the petition is anywhere near finished.
Sure. I mean, I was going to say, it's just a case, is it not, of keep knocking on the door until eventually Evers thinks, who is that knocking on the door? Will somebody answer the door? And then he goes and answers the door himself. And eventually we might get there. One final question. I realise I've kept you both, kept Tracy here for best part of 75 minutes. And that's...
Paul, did you not know that I was awarded recently from my job the Non-Stop Talking Award? So
yes. I believe that was that the previous recipient of that was a certain Eric Cozy over there on Crunch Island.
Oh yeah.
Actually, I tell you what. See if you want to make the dude smile. Just mention the Melbourne Conference Centre and getting to meet Drizzen, Nyrider, and Rudolph.
You mean the convention center?
Yes.
Yeah. And by the way, I did hear the opening when you were saying you thought I wasn't listening. I heard all that, by the way.
Yeah. and is that the T-shirt that Drizzen put on?
Well, it's same color, but it's a different.
Is it right?
Same one, but not the same exact shirt. But
right. So did Steve Drizzen get to keep that T-shirt?
Yeah, I left one for Laura too, but she never chose to put it on and tweet a picture out. So what are you gonna do?
Yeah, I think back to meeting them, and it was quite a special thing, I think, altogether. But my husband had said to me afterwards, he goes, "You didn't even talk to David Rudolph," and I said,
"I didn't even talk to Laura Nyrider."
I said, isn't that awful? Like I literally, the only thing I remember saying to Mr. Rudolph was, the owl story is incredulous,
Right. I do remember you. Yeah.
And then my husband said, I felt I had to talk to him because you were ignoring him. And I was like, I've waited such a long time to, meet Stephen and Laura that, unfortunately, Mr. Rudolph was forgotten, but anyway.
Yeah, for me it was I talked to Rudolph, but I didn't really talk to Laura. That was what I ended up not doing.
Yeah.
So
it's I got the opportunity, as I say, in Amsterdam during the whole time that Jerry Buting was signing his books, and I mean he would have sold in one evening in Amsterdam double what Ken Kratz has ever sold in his career. And of course I had all that time chatting with David Rudolph and also the prosecutor that was hosting the event. It was absolutely brilliant. And dare I say it, a lot of it was actually talking about a certain Eric Cozy and his channel and his devotion to wrongful convictions. So if your ears were ringing that day, it was because of me. I just want to finish off with a question. Well, ladies first, if that's okay, Eric Cozy.
Sure. Just remember, she's not so amused with Ken Kratz. So just anyway.
I realise that. I'm not going to mention his name again.
All right, there we go.
Is there? It's a very slight concern, I suppose. Is there a scenario in which Brendan Dassey being given clemency, that there could be some sort of deal involved that could be damaging for Steve? Is that something that might? Is there a scenario in which that could happen? Do you know?
I think the train of thought itself is quite polarizing. These are two separate cases.
Mm-hmm.
Why should what Brendan's team pursue influence the outcome of what Stephen's attorneys are doing?
Mm-hmm.
Should Brendan be granted a pardon? It is on the particular circumstances of Brendan's case, the individual that he is, and the facts of his case. All of that differs to that of Stephen's. So I don't see how a pardon would influence the outcome of a Brady violation, or the appeals process based on new evidence or ineffective assistance claims. For Stephen, of course it wouldn't. I mean, I'm not a legal expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I can't imagine a clemency deal involving something for a particular individual affecting a co-defendant. I don't think that that's possible. I just think it's a polarizing thought, and I've seen a lot of people who try to create a divisive vibe between those who are really vocal for Brendan. And what I would say to those people is that if you deep dive into the people who support Brendan, there will be a commonality of why they are very vocal and why they support Brendan. But that does not mean that they don't support Stephen also. So for myself personally, I've been messaged many times by people saying, do you not believe that Stephen Avery is innocent? And I'm like, yes, I do believe Stephen Avery is innocent, but I advocate for Brendan. I think that, Stephen's in great hands. There's thousands and thousands of people advocating for Stephen. It's for me, I think if you surveyed Brendan's support base, and I really wanted to say this because it's very evident on Twitter, some people try to do this. If you surveyed Brendan's support base, you'll find that everyone's been affected by Brendan's injustice in the same way. Brendan and who he is and who he continues to be and the investment he gives to the many people who write to him. We all experience the same thoughtful young guy, right? And he is young. So I think Brendan's vulnerability and the youth at the time of his conviction resonates with the support base. And if you get granular with that support base, you are going to find empaths, parents, proud mothers of children with autism, the disabled, attorney, care workers, psychologists, activists. People are profoundly affected because of how they relate to the 16-year-old suggestible, socially avoidant child that was subjected to every parent's nightmare. So that's where Brendan resonates with people. But it does not mean that they don't support Stephen. I think you would find that the majority of Brendan supporters do support Stephen. They're just not vocal about it. It's like, I don't know, it's like, I think Leonardo DiCaprio was fucking awesome in Once Upon a Time in America, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But like Brad Pitt was pretty good too. So it's like I can have.
Actually, I want to see that. That's the new Tarantino film. Yeah, I want to see that.
Yeah,
that looks good. Particularly the line where he's like, where they talk about carrying the load, and it cuts to Brad Pitt. He's like, would you describe that as what you do? What carrying his load? Yeah.
I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it, Richard. It's one of Tarantino's best, I think.
I love Tarantino, so
Oh, so do I. So do I. I think with just finishing off on that, because it was something I wanted to say. I think it is interesting that Zellner has a massive fan base.
Yes.
But we've got to remember that is Stephen's supporter base. So, there is the support just takes on different forms, I think.
Yeah.
And God forbid you cross an angry, hormonal 50-year-old woman. But I think anyone who makes it divisive, who tries to separate that Brendan support from the Stephen support, is doing the family and Brendan and Stephen a great disservice.
Yeah,
I think Manitowoc did enough of that in 2005. So let's learn from that, I think. And just rolling it back to that, I think they're two separate cases. I can't understand under any sort of legal maneuvering how Brendan being granted clemency would ever interact with Stephen's claims of Brady violations.
I feel the same
doesn't
way.
make sense.
I feel the same way. I basically, and I would explain it this way. I would have great difficulty in seeing how something that happens in the executive branch with Governor Evers regarding Brendan, which is not in the courts, it's not in the court of law, it's not a fact finding. There's nothing about it that would be, admissible in a court. So in my mind, I gotta, it just kind of seems like, no, it probably wouldn't. Just because there's no fact that it's not the part of the judicial branch. So there's, I don't see how anything could really cross over.
Yeah. And it just brings me back to, like you do see it on Twitter, particularly the people that are trying to create that divide. The whole idea of conspiracy is, it's for me, it's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. But, to say that, Brendan's team pursuing a particular route to relief would impact Stephen. No. I don't think so.
Yeah, I suppose my observation would be that, Brendan didn't take the plea deal. He has always stuck by what he said. He has never tried to damage Steve before. I don't think Brendan is interested in taking any kind of option that would damage Steve, because otherwise his last 13, 14, 15 years have been a complete and utter waste of time.
I don't think it would even be a consideration for his team.
Yeah.
I don't think it would even come into play. I don't see how it would.
Okay.
They're at different levels of, Stephen's winding through the appeals process. Brendan's filed for clemency. This total separate.
Right.
I just want to finish up by saying I've gone through and it's sometimes it's quite interesting looking through the whole of Judge Duffin's original decision. I've started going through the whole of Richard Leo and Steve Drizzen's article, the false confessions in the post DNA world. And I've only got so far in that. So my next question would be, would you two please accept this invitation to join me again in a future live chat to discuss further some of the experts? I noticed Travis was going on about Richard Ofshe. Is that how you pronounce it? You've mentioned Saul Kassan. I'm reading stuff about him at the moment. Obviously, Richard Leo. And one or two of the other names, obviously even Barry, is it Barry Scheck?
Barry Scheck, yep.
Was the guy that started the Center for Wrongful Convictions.
He founded the Innocence Projects, yeah.
Sorry, the Innocence Project. So if it was possible, would you accept my invitation to come back on at a future time?
He's really only asking you, Tracy. So.
I thought if it came from both of us, that we might be able to win the lady over. That was, what was your charm and my good looks, Richard? I thought that's into work.
Oh, I love it. Yeah,
it's not a Jane Eyre novel, guys. It's of course that's fine. Yeah, well, as long as you can put up with my tangents, it's all
absolutely, absolutely. I often see what I do is simply bringing a few people onto the channel and just let the chat go, and let's just see where it takes us, because we'll always end up coming back to the certain points that we that we feel strongly about. So Jude, many thanks for finding the time to come and join us. And to Tracy, it's been absolutely fantastic having you out on live. Look forward to the next time. Let's hope that Governor Evers does decide to answer the knocking on his door, right, and gets and gets on board, gets on the train, as it were. So
I have full belief that he will.
Good. Okie dokie.
I mean, he seems like he should be inclined, seeing as his background's in education and he cares about kids so much. It seems like this should come right into his wheelhouse. But maybe there's just a little garbling going on, and he's just not getting it.
I don't think he personally has looked at it. I think he's been advised, and they've gone with the criteria, and that's it. Whereas, as we know, that criteria is not law. Something that's not law is movable, and if you have enough people, and I think for me, Governor Evers is still in the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, we don't know the sort of machinations that go on within the governor's office. So therefore, just keep knocking on the door in the hope that eventually he'll answer it. Part of me thinks that he's waiting to see what happens in Steve's case. I think there's that would be something that what might swing him once we really start to get moving in Steve's case.
I believe, seeing as he most likely hasn't actually reviewed Brendan's case for himself, I think that may be a good point. Mm-hmm. He may have just been scared of it. He may have been wanting to do something about it, but been scared of it. And maybe he is waiting to see what happens with Stephen. Maybe he is waiting for something groundbreaking to come from the courts. But I don't know. For me, Brendan's innocence is obvious, regardless of where you stand with Steve, because it's just so freaking obvious. I mean, the kid's guessing the whole damn time. There's no confidence in Brendan in anything he says. It's all guesses, and and a lot of wrong guesses, and it's. But hopefully he will get a team of people that hopefully this will get in front of his face, and he will go, okay, and he'll get a team of people that will dig into it and be his, be the ones to brief him on it and give him a full briefing on it. If, obviously he's governor. Okay, look, you don't have time to dig into an entire court case. I got it. Hire some people to do it for you.
Yeah.
So,
and the state fails, and not just Wisconsin, but the state fails in so many cases that laws, legislation is changed by the people. So I think it's vitally important that everybody continues to email Governor Evers. I think it's vitally important that letters are being sent to Governor Evers. As I don't know if you're aware, but over 100 inmates at Oshkosh Correctional all wrote to Governor Evers in support of Dassey's clemency petition. It's 99.9% of the population do not believe that Brendan Dassey should be anywhere near a correctional facility. And that's why I implore everyone to keep up
I agree.
their pressure on the governor's office.
That kind of thing popping up in his face constantly, folks, that's probably going to be the thing to wear him down.
Yeah. Tweet at him. Whoever is looking after his Twitter account, let them be overwhelmed. Who cares? This is Brendan. This is Brendan's life. And the least that we can do is to put pressure on through social media and through emails. Just bloody do it. Just take 5 minutes every single day. We've got one particular lady posted today in a Facebook group that she's bought all this paper, all these envelopes. She's going to send Governor Evers a letter every single day for 6 months. That to me is commitment. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to email Governor Evers every single day until he grants Brendan clemency, because I firmly believe that he will.
Yeah. I think that's the key too. I mean, it's just keeping it in his face, keeping it where he, it's just to the point where they just go, you know what? Let's really look at this. You know what I mean? And this is going to keep coming back on us until we actually really look at this.
And we're not going anywhere.
We're going to have to offer a denial that shows we've gone through it, or we're going to have to, offer a pardon that shows we've gone through it. But we're going to have to go through it.
Yeah. And another thing, if you think about Brendan's legal counsel, you think about his team, right? It's a karmic team from who he had back in 2006 and 7. He had his co-counsel is a former US Solicitor General.
Right.
That is his co-counsel now. Seth Waxman is his co-counsel. The caliber of people behind that experts letter, the caliber of people who are vocal in support, people like Dave Thompson, who's an absolute gun from Wicklow to Zalowski. You have Marty Tancliffe, you have Jason Baldwin, Jason Strong. All of these guys are actively, tweeting at Governor Evers for Brendan.
And the kid from the West Memphis 3. Damien, right? Damien
Eccles.
Yeah. Him.
Yeah. Sir Peter Jackson. Jackson. Every time I see something from him, I'm just like, the guy has so much class. Like, he's, I love his attitude, but, we're not wrong. We're not wrong. So it's just a matter of bringing Governor Evers around to the same conclusions that everybody else has, and that's through information. Yeah. And I don't believe he's looked at it, and that's why he hasn't arrived at the same conclusion.
I agree.
So I do have one more question. Maybe Tracy can answer. Who actually won the Aussie Rules football sort of league when it finished? Just
yeah, sure. I can tell you that because I have 2 supporters in the house. It's the Richmond Tigers.
Now, hold on a second. We must just clarify for Eric Rose's benefit. He's not interested in the men's Aussie Rules football. He wants to know who won the women's Aussie Rules.
I found both to be entertaining. The women's was entertaining in a slightly different way, but anyway.
Very, very entertaining.
I'm not laughing. This is an absolute Me Too moment. I'm only joking. I actually don't know who won the women's. I don't know.
But the Richmond Tigers, Richmond, that is a part of Melbourne.
It is. It's a suburb of Melbourne.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't know that. We met some Richmond supporters as we were walking through Melbourne from the conference sentence. And they were high as a kite, weren't they? They were as high as a kite.
That guy was, he was a character.
Yeah.
They do tend to be. I have 2 of them.
Yeah. Okay, well, you know the routine by now, dude.
Yeah, that's bye for me.
Tracy?
Oh, that is so cheesy. I don't know if I can get that out of my mouth.
3 Ronnies?
Okay, it's bye from me.
And it's goodbye from them. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
So long, folks.
See you, Richard. Bye. Bye.
Oh, dear.